A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. Glad to be behind the microphone with you once again. Glad to have David Harsanyi of The Federalist, who's going to join us here in just a few minutes as well, talking about some of the kookier gun control ideas that we have seen proposed. And sadly, no matter how kooky they might be, that does not mean that they cannot become a law and not just a proposal. Before we get to David, though, I do want to get to a couple of headlines, including some real gun safety. I mean, if you're like me, you probably hear the phrase gun safety and you think, oh, geez, here we go again. It's just gun control, right? And that was my first impression last night when I saw a headline about a gun safety group in Colorado that had this new map that they say couldn't save lives. And I did some research, and no, honestly, this is an actual, honest-to-goodness gun safety group. This isn't about putting new gun control laws on the books. This is about empowering gun owners to make good decisions and to be able to help them make good decisions when they need to. So it's called the Colorado Firearms Safety Coalition. It's a group of individuals made up of firearms instructors, gun store owners, as well as mental health professionals and academics. And what they've done is they put together this map. It's an interactive map of the state of Colorado. And you can see all of the little red guns there. Those are private gun stores or FFLs that have agreed to or are willing to at least consider temporarily holding somebody's firearms for them if need be. Those blue circles, that's law enforcement in Colorado that's agreed to do the same thing. That yellow circle right there in the center of the map, that is basically a vault company. And they too have agreed that if you need to store your firearms temporarily, that you can do so. It may be that there's somebody in your home who's having a mental health crisis. You feel better if they don't have if the guns aren't in the house, and you've asked somebody to watch over your prescription medication, and somebody's gotten the sharp knives out. But also, if you are going on vacation, you got a business trip, you're going to be away from your home for an extended period of time, you don't want to leave your firearms there without somebody watching over them, this is an option. And this is a really easy way to figure out, okay, where is someplace near me where I can do this? Again, there's no law imposed here. There's no requirement that if you're going out of town, you got to go to one of these places and turn over all your firearms. It's not about that. It's actually, again, about helping and empowering gun owners whenever they, need something like this. I think it's a fantastic idea. I'd love to see this actually implemented nationwide. There's no reason why other states couldn't do this. And maybe we'll see something like this coming to a state near you in the future. Now, something that you are probably more likely to see rather than something useful like this map, quote-unquote gun buybacks, which are not useful at all. And in San Antonio, several members of the city council want to put a quote-unquote gun buyback program in place. They want to use money from the police's civil asset forfeiture fund. The chief there in San Antonio, Bill McManus, not a big fan of the idea. He says, look, it's a noble idea, but it doesn't work to reduce violent crime. It's not going to help us, stop homicides and things of that nature. That's just not who takes part in these events. And the chief is right, with the exception of this really isn't a noble thing either. Because I don't believe that saying, hey, we're from the government, we're going to give you some money in exchange for you handing in your guns, that's not ennobling to me in any stretch of the imagination. But the chief is correct when he says that these programs don't reduce crime. They don't reduce homicide. Studies have shown that after a buyback is held or a compensated confiscation program is held, that crimes don't go down. Murders don't go down. Suicides don't go down. Accidents involving firearms don't drop. I would say it's a feel-good measure, but really the only people it makes feel good really are the politicians who propose it. It's not about public safety. It's about public relations. It's about these particular city council members in San Antonio being able to hold a press conference, generate some headlines, say they're doing something, and they're not doing anything productive at all. So we'll see if this program actually goes forward with the chief objecting to this. I suspect that it likely will there in San Antonio. I also suspect that it won't do a bit of good. In Massachusetts today, a legislative committee set to hear dozens, plural, of gun control proposals, everything from rationing firearm purchases to one per month to expanding the state's quote-unquote magazine ban and making it even more restrictive and more onerous than it already is. There are a couple of, I think, good measures that are going to be discussed. Jim Wallace of the NonGunners actually notes that there's a bill that would actually establish firearms preemption law in Massachusetts so that cities and localities can't pass gun control laws that are more restrictive than the state. I don't expect that bill's going to pass, unfortunately. I think we're going to see a laundry list of gun control items pass out of this committee. The good news is that they don't immediately become law. There's still a couple of more votes to go, and then they'd go to Governor Charlie Baker's desk, and he's been kind of a mixed bag. He's certainly signed some gun control laws in the past. Unclear whether or not he would sign anything and everything that gets to his desk, but hopefully we'll have a chance to talk with Jim Wallace of the NonGunners actually on tomorrow's Bearing Arms Cam and Company, find out what exactly the legislative committee did there in Boston today. But we know from around the country that there are no shortage of really, really egregious, extreme, unconstitutional, ill-founded, unenforceable, ill-considered pieces of gun control legislation that are being introduced out there. Right? Everything from requiring gun licenses to permits to purchase to the aforementioned one gun per month law to San Jose's mayor saying you got to buy an insurance policy if you want to own a gun. And if you don't buy the insurance policy, well, you can just give us a fee to exercise your rights instead. David Harsanyi of The Federalist has been covering the Second Amendment almost as long as I have, as a matter of fact. He's the author of the book First Freedom, and he joins us now to talk about some of these. What do I want to? I want to be family friendly here. Some of these really, really bad ideas. David, thanks so much for coming on the show, sir. It's great talking to you today.
Always a pleasure to speak to you.
I'm glad we get to have you back. And, you're one of the most thoughtful voices that I know when it comes to examining gun control laws. And there's been a lot to examine these days. In fact, Splinter News had a piece just yesterday on how to disarm America. And basically it was, let's adopt every possible gun control law that we can think of in an effort to really drive down the rate of legal gun ownership, which really seems to be something that gun control advocates are feeling freer to talk about more and more lately.
Yeah, I mean, we should stop pretending that these laws aren't meant to inhibit legal gun ownership, that they're not meant to bring down the number of weapons out there. I mean, all these laws, obviously, and this is the central problem and the central debate, all these laws are typically meant to, are aimed at people who are law-abiding citizens. They're the ones who will do whatever these people want, register their gun, universal background checks, all that stuff. So, as well as assault weapon, whatever that means, bans. So, that is the central part of this. It's incrementalism. They, from the beginning, at least there are good faith. There are people who make good faith arguments out there, but most of the sort of activist class here, they want to incrementally get to a point where they can make it harder and harder for there to be guns in general out there.
Right. And I guess the idea is, if we just make it impossible for people to legally own guns, eventually that'll have some sort of access or some sort of impact on the ability of criminals to access firearms, right? Because there won't be any legally owned guns around for them to steal or to buy via a straw purchase or on the black market because that supply will have just dried up.
For some of them, yes, but I mean, for some of them, I don't even think they think that deeply about it. I think they just believe guns are bad in general, and we have to do whatever we can to take the guns out of the hands of everyone. So, like in Maryland, where I live outside of D.C., it's very hard to get a gun, and people, that's what they want to do. I think it's unconstitutional. I think it should be unconstitutional, the level of sort of hoops people have to jump through here to get a gun, and I think that's what they want nationally. They just want fewer guns. I mean, I'm not saying that there are people who obviously don't want. I mean, listen, I don't think anyone wants school shootings or anything of that nature, but I think that they always see these tragic moments as a time where they can sort of use the sadness and the urgency of do something to move forward in their larger plan. Is that,
No,
I
I
mean,
think that's right.
tough on them, but I mean, I don't know if you agree with that, but that's how I see it now.
No, I think I do agree with you. And, you talk about Maryland. It's interesting. I just mentioned in the show a couple of minutes ago, there's a researcher at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, the Bloomberg School of Public Health, named Cassandra Cravasi, who acknowledged this to Vox in a story earlier this year. She talked about Maryland or Massachusetts licensing law, and she noted that this licensing law is so restrictive that it prevents people who have no ill intent whatsoever from purchasing a firearm because they say it's just not worth the hassle. And then she says, and then there's less exposure to firearms, right? So it's a good thing in the mind of these gun control advocates to put so many barriers between you and the exercise of your constitutionally protected rights that some law-abiding Americans will simply throw up their hands in frustration and say, forget it, it's not worth it.
Yeah. I mean, listen, we see it every time now. Every time there's a shooting, they immediately, the gun control folks immediately go and land on the same things they've been saying for a decade now, I mean, maybe red flag laws are something new. And honestly, that's the one area I think where there might be some room to talk about stuff. I mean, even though I think most of these laws already exist and the cops can already deal with folks the kid in Parkland and elsewhere shouldn't have had a gun to begin with, but they land on assault weapon bans, which we know don't do anything to diminish these mass shootings, right? We know, or very little or nothing. I mean, I don't know, maybe there's a study out there that says differently. Or universal background checks. Most Americans don't understand what these things mean, in my opinion. Don't understand that we already have basically universal background checks. They don't understand that, that every one of these, that no shooter, I don't know of any shooter, unless the system failed in some way, that would have been stopped by any of these laws. But yet, they always come back to them. So what does that tell you? That tells you really want to stop law-abiding people from having guns, because none of these issues focus on the mass shootings.
And I think that you hit on a really important point where you talk about how most non-gun owners don't understand what it is that these laws would actually do and what these phrases actually mean. And it's not because they're dumb. It's because they're not gun owners. They don't really have to know about this stuff. They don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about what quote unquote universal background checks mean. But I saw a poll in Ohio, for instance. I think this came out last week. 90% approval for background checks on all sales of firearms, 48% support for stricter gun control laws in Ohio.
We see it with, and I don't want to jump to topics off of gun, but we see it with Medicare for all, right? We'll say, do you support Medicare for all? And people like Medicare. Why not? Why shouldn't everyone have it, And then you tell them, well, you'll lose this or that, your private insurance. And then all of a sudden the number craters. And I think you'd see the same sort of thing with gun control. You always hear, I saw the March for Life put out their, gun confiscation plan, and they constantly point to polling. Polling doesn't really mean anything unless you really dive deep and understand what people think and know about the issues you're talking about. And on guns, again, I'm not trying to mock anyone. I don't know a lot about a lot of things either. You have to learn. And with guns, especially with background checks, I don't think people understand the issue very much. Same thing with assault weapons. I mean, you constantly see people who are supposed to be experts who write stories about this for Politico and the New York Times and the Washington Post don't know the difference between automatic and semi-automatic weapons. That's a big problem, I think.
Do you think they really don't know, or do you think they just don't really want their audience to know? Because I've got my suspicions about some of these folks.
Depends who you're talking to. I think when you have the hardcore activist types out there, they purposely conflate all kinds of stuff. Semi-auto, suicides, homicides, they want it to seem like a giant problem, which, in many ways, well, actually, that it is not. But I think yes, but I also think sometimes you just have reporters are on a beat. They don't care enough. They don't know enough. They live in place in bubbles where no one has guns. They just don't care enough to know. And that's a problem in itself.
That's absolutely right. They don't care enough to know. And you're right. If you're a reporter, that's a problem no matter what issue it is that you're covering. You better care enough to not look like an ass when you start writing up your story or you start, stand in front of a camera for your stand-up. Now, I do want to talk about a quote unquote assaultments for a second, because late September, the House is planning on voting on a sweeping semi-auto ban, also a mag ban as well. You've got candidates like Beto O'Rourke out there saying, we need to ban these battlefield weapons of wars and take them off the streets. And one of the things I noted with this Splinter news story yesterday is that this guy had, this whole laundry list of things he wanted to put on the books, and then there was no mention of how it would be enforced. Beto O'Rourke says, these battlefield weapons of war don't belong on our streets, and if you own one after we ban one, you're going to have to pay a fine. Which seems a little weird, but at least he's actually kind of talking about enforcement. It seems like enforcing the laws that these people talk about is really a non-concern for them. They believe that it's simply enough to put them on the books, and then after that, the guns magically disappear.
Well, when it comes to enforcement, I think we have to separate it into two issues. One is it constitutional at all to like this? I was talking to our friend Charles Cook recently, and he points out something that I've thought about as well, is that, if you ban one semi-automatic weapon and not another, that's a constitutional issue, because you're talking about a mechanism now that is banned just because of aesthetics. What is the guiding principle of that? How can you limit a constitutional right just merely one that looks a certain way and one that doesn't look? There would be for sure some kind of constitutional challenge to any kind of national law like that, I think. And maybe we'd lose. I don't know. But on the other hand, is the 400 or whatever million weapons that are out there, and how you're supposed to confiscate them. With a buyback program, it's not going to work. Especially, it's not really a buyback program. It's a confiscation program where we give you some money for giving us. Yep. And I just don't see most Second Amendment advocates or gun fans doing that at all. So that would be a big problem. At some point, someone has to go to someone's house and ask them for their gun, and then you have a big, giant problem in this country.
It would be. I mean, and even beyond that, let's say magically Americans, say, okay, we're going to hand over most of our guns. You go and you are able to confiscate firearms from people peacefully. It doesn't lead to, civil unrest. Right now, there are less than 30,000 Americans in the federal prison system on weapons charges. You've got, 17 million Americans who own these firearms that Beto wants to ban? I mean, it's no wonder why he's calling for a fine instead of prison time, because you actually start thinking about what it would take to try to enforce any of these gun control laws that they want to put on the books against the, as you say, 100 million Americans who are legal gun owners right now. You're running out of prison space real soon, David. And these folks are all champions of criminal justice reform. They believe the war on drugs is a failure. And yet they're calling for replacing it with a war on legal gun ownership.
Which is a constitutional right, A, but B, you're creating, you're making immediately millions of people criminals.
Yeah.
Wrong, who followed the law until now, who it's just absurd. I can't really think of anything comparable to that ever happening in the United States, not even prohibition, where that's, something that runs out, even if you own liquor, it would run out, where a gun is, and you have no constitutional right to drink alcohol anyway. So it's mind-boggling. But I think, it's a cultural thing as well. I just want to go back a little bit. Where I grew up, people didn't have guns. The very thought of a gun was a negative thought. People did not care if it was a semi-auto or auto. For most people, it's just something negative. How do we stop more people from having them? How do we get them off the streets? These are the sentences people use. And when I moved somewhere else where people didn't think about guns that way, it changed my view as well. So I think it's a cultural thing. A lot of people, I think we need, I don't want to rag on the NRA or anything here, but I just think we need people proselytizing, better informing, trying to change people's minds, informing them and educating them a little bit better. Because now we have a cultural divide, I think, that's very different than we used to have, where entire urban areas, even in red states, people do not know guns. They're just scared of them, and they don't understand them at all.
No, I think that's right. And again, I mean, that's part of, I think, the gun control activist efforts to reduce the number of legal gun owners, right? To make it hard to establish a culture of lawful gun ownership. I mean, you look at what's going on in California right now, where they're trying to shut down gun shows. Alameda County, passes a zoning ordinance that'll prevent any new gun stores from opening up. It's been 10 years since the Heller decision. Washington, D.C. doesn't have a range where gun owners can actually go and train and be responsible with their firearms. And so you're right that, go ahead.
No, just saying it changed almost nothing here in Washington, D.C. in any sort of real way for gun owners, right? I mean, I just think that Heller is important, really important, and McDonald and other, legal decisions are important. But in the end, it's a cultural thing, and it's getting worse and worse. Where, I just don't see a very happy ending here. So let's say there's a national. Let's say somehow the Senate okays this sweeping gun confiscation plan that Democrats have, and that semi-automatics are taken away from people. Nothing changes really on the ground. No one's going to really hand over their gun. What I'm trying to say is there's going to be a real cultural problem in this country that ends in a bad place. And I don't see a good way forward here. I don't know. Maybe you do. I'm kind of nervous about the future.
Well, I'm always nervous about the future.
Meaning people don't care what the Supreme Court says anymore in a way. Heller didn't really change anyone's mind about whether it's a collective rights or an individual right or anything like that. And nothing changes. The debate is the same. All that matters is who's in charge, really.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I've been sort of obliquely hinting at this in some of my stories at Bearing Arms, but I need to write something that just explicitly states this. When I first started covering this issue back in 2004 on a daily basis, pretty much every argument that you would hear from a gun owner was based on the Constitution. And now, as you say, like, those arguments are falling on deaf ears. They don't care if this violates the Constitution. They don't care if the Second Amendment is a dead letter. In fact, it makes it easier for them, right? They don't want to repeal it because that's hard, but they would love to just ignore it. And so the arguments that we use and the individual attempts to, I think, expand lawful gun culture can't just be based on, well, it's a constitutional right. Because we've got tens of millions of Americans who don't care, and we've got millions more who don't want it to be a constitutional right. So that's one of the reasons why I bring up things like criminal justice reform. And do you really want to replace the war on drugs with the war on guns? Think about the consequences of your actions. If we can't reach some of these folks through the Constitution, and it's sad that we can't, can we use some of their other positions and point out, if you like that, you really can't support these new gun control laws?
I think there is an audience for that, though I think it's getting smaller. I have no proof of this, by the way. This is just how I feel about the country. I think the constitutional arguments are falling deaf ears for the most part now. I make them because I'm a big fan of the Constitution, but I've never heard someone say, that's true. When I read your book, I noticed that the first, that there were no arguments for collective theory, only individual right arguments. So now I agree with you. It's not going to happen. But I think you're right. You have to find other ways in. And I think one of them is to talk about how important being able to why the Second Amendment exists to begin with, the ancient right to self-defense. The notion that I'm allowed to protect my family, my property, and the country from tyranny. I never can understand what people call Donald Trump Nazis and then want to take your guns away. It doesn't make any sense to me, but somehow it makes sense to them. So I think it's important to try to make those arguments, though I think they're getting more and more difficult because guns have become more of a partisan issue over the last 2 decades. Mm-hmm. And partisan issues are tribal issues, and very hard to shake someone out of their tribal beliefs.
It is. You're right. See, I was so much more optimistic when we started this conversation, David. Now you've got me all depressed about the future.
Here's the thing, though. I feel depressed about the future in many ways, and I think I'm worried about the Constitution as a whole and the Bill of Rights. I'm least worried about the Second Amendment. I think I might have mentioned this one time to you before, is because you're actually talking about something physical that people have in their hands, and it's very difficult to take that right away from them.
Absolutely.
Probably because of democratic, the media and how we're now conversing, for instance. But the Second Amendment's even harder, and I think it's better protected than religious rights, for instance, where we see people being forced to do things they don't want. It's very hard to take a gun away from someone. That's why you have the gun, and that's the whole point of the Second Amendment.
Exactly. Yeah. David, listen, man, I appreciate you joining me on the program. It's really good catching up with you. I hope you'll come back and do this again very soon.
Anytime. Always have fun talking to you, man.
Appreciate it. David Harsanyi from The Federalist joining us here on Bearing Arms, Cam & Company. All right, now let's get to our armed citizen story. We also have an incredible good deed of the day and an abysmal failure of the criminal justice system to tell you about as well. In fact, let's start there. in Cincinnati, WLWT reporting on a man who, I mean, this is absolutely horrific. So this guy stabbed his dad, allegedly, and then took off in a stolen car, allegedly, and then ended up crashing into multiple vehicles, killing 2 kids, injuring 10 other people. And according to authorities, this guy, Raymond Walters Jr., has been out of prison for less than a month. Yeah. So media reporting this at WHIO says he's suspected of the stabbing of his dad in a black pickup truck in Dayton on Monday evening and then crashing the truck a short time later. At the scene of that crash, officers say that he then got into a Riverside, Ohio police SUV and fled into Dayton, where he then crashed into vehicles outside of the Dayton Metro Library. 2 6-year-old children died in this crash. 10 other people were injured. And according to WHIO, Walters was on probation for a robbery. He has a lengthy criminal history. He was incarcerated starting August of 2017 for a felony robbery conviction. He was released on August 10th of this year and was placed on 3 years of parole. Supervised release. So he did 2 years for felony robbery. He has previous felony convictions for theft, drug possession, and robbery. He was also previously charged with felony assault and other offenses, but the charges were dismissed. 2 years. That's it. For a repeat felon, eligible for far more than that under Ohio law, and yet, again, he's going to do more time. Well, he would have done more time on probation than he did behind bars for that robbery. If he had actually been sentenced to the full extent of the law, none of this would have happened, because Raymond Walters Jr. would have been in prison instead of in a truck with his dad. All right, let's get to our armed citizen story of the day. Also from Ohio, the Akron, Ohio area. Daniel McGowan is 73 years old. He's a retired attorney. He had gone to visit friends or a family over the weekend. When he got back, he realized that his home had been broken into. Several firearms had been stolen. A laptop was taken. And Mr. McGowan was concerned that these thieves would return because there were still some valuable items in the home. So that night, when Daniel McGowan went to bed, he brought a pistol that had not been stolen and put it under his pillow while he slept. At about 5:30 the next morning, he woke up to the sound of somebody in his house. So he grabbed his pistol, he walked downstairs, he found an individual there in his home and held him until police arrived. At one point, Daniel McGowan actually realized that he had left his cell phone upstairs, so he marches the guy up the stairs. He's behind him with the gun pointed at his back. And police were able to take this guy into custody. The good news is that Daniel McGowan is okay, like the vast majority of defensive gun uses in this country. Trigger wasn't pulled. The presence of that firearm in Mr. McGowan's hands was enough to prevent that crime from escalating any further. 51-year-old Thomas Gaffney has been arrested. He's right now charged with 1 count of burglary, but police are investigating to see if he has any connection to a string of burglaries in the neighborhood over the past 6 weeks or so. Mr. McGowan said he was able to go back to sleep after that. He said, I didn't view it as taking the law into my own hands. He said, what I viewed it as, my home was being violated, and here was a guy doing it in my presence. Here's the guy, and I want him to stop doing it. Once I made him stop doing it, I had no trouble going to sleep because I had done what I was supposed to do and no more. There you go. All right, finally, we will leave you this afternoon with a story from Kentucky, Scottsville, Kentucky, where a police officer saved the day responding to a call in Scottsville, Kentucky. This officer ended up having to deal with a 19-month-old boy who was not breathing, which is, I mean, it's just one of the scariest things that you can deal with. Aiden is his name, Aiden King. His dad, Nicholas, says that Aiden's airway is underdeveloped for his age. He says, so we've lost jobs because we've had to take him to Vanderbilt Hospital numerous times. They have, the parents lost a premature daughter earlier this year, so you can imagine how terrifying this was to See little Aiden not breathing. Misty King says, when it's your own, it's hard, especially when you buried another 5 months ago. And again, thanks to the quick actions of Sergeant James Talbot, who had just been recertified in CPR training 2 weeks before, he was able to perform infant CPR on little Aiden, clear the child's airway. They did take him to Vanderbilt University Medical Center for treatment, but he was released later that evening. And Sergeant Talbot has been presented, according to WNKY, with a certificate of appreciation and has been nominated to receive the Scottsville Police Department Life-Saving Medal. He says that he's very thankful for that recertification in CPR that helped give him, he says, the confidence to save the young child. And Aiden's parents are now asking that the CPR recertification actually be done every year, as opposed to every other year, so that if officers do find themselves in a situation like that, they know how to respond. That is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. Thank you again for tuning into the program. Tomorrow on the show, Kareem Shia with Open Source Defense was supposed to be here today, but that's my fault. Actually, it's the fault of the Amish farmer who was in his carriage going about 5 miles an hour as I was trying to get to the studio this morning. Anyway, Kareem's going to join us on the program tomorrow. He's got a fascinating piece at Open Source Defense on completely rethinking our current background check system. Is there a way to get to quote-unquote universal background checks that doesn't lead to a gun registry, that doesn't lead to gun licensing? It sounds like there might be, although it's going to take a complete revamping of the system. So we'll talk with Kareem Shia about that coming up on the next Bearing Arms Cam and Company. If you want the podcast version of the program, don't forget you can find us on iTunes, on Spotify, on Stitcher. If you want to get us in your YouTube inbox. I don't know what the heck that is. Anyway, if you want to find us on YouTube, you want to watch the video, subscribe to Town Hall Media at YouTube, and you can get us there each and every day. Thanks so much. We'll see you tomorrow with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company.